At 3 a.m., I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a screen I was never meant to see. My husband was asleep upstairs, peaceful, unaware that everything I believed about my life had just collapsed. For 32 years, I trusted him with my heart, my future, and every dollar I earned. That night, I discovered how carefully he had been undoing me, quietly, patiently, and without remorse. He thought I was too old to notice. Too loyal to question. Too gentle to fight back. What he didn't understand was this: when a woman finally stops pretending not to see the truth, the story doesn't end, it begins. And before this was over, everyone would learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate the woman sleeping beside you. At 60 years old, I believed I had earned the right to some peace, a quiet reward for the 32 years I spent scrubbing floors, raising 2 children, and working double shifts at the hospital to build our family empire. My husband, Marcus, always called me his queen, but lately, that title felt more like a heavy crown of thorns that I was forced to wear while he looked right through me. We sat at the dinner table in a silence so thick it felt like a third person was sitting between us, breathing down our necks and mocking the history we had built. I watched the way he handled his phone, tilting the screen away whenever a notification chirped, his thumbs moving with a frantic energy that didn't match his usual slow, methodical nature. He thought I was blind to the way he smelled of expensive perfume that didn't belong to me, or the way he suddenly started wearing silk shirts and expensive watches I didn't remember buying. I felt a cold chill settle in my bones, a primitive instinct telling me that the foundation of my life was cracking beneath my feet, yet I chose to smile and pass him the salt. Every time he laughed at a text message and told me it was just work, a small piece of my heart withered away, replaced by a dark, simmering curiosity. I started wondering what else he was hiding behind that practiced smile and those perfectly white teeth that I had paid for with my own overtime checks. The man I loved was fading away, replaced by a stranger who seemed to be counting down the minutes until he could leave the room and get back to his secret life. I know most of you have faced this same situation, feeling the shift in the wind before the storm hits, knowing deep down that the loyalty you gave is being traded for a lie that will eventually break everything. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday morning when I went to the bank to withdraw a small amount for our granddaughter's birthday present, only to have the teller look at me with a face full of pity. She told me the dream account, the one Marcus and I had contributed to for 3 decades to fund our retirement travels, was sitting at a balance of less than $50. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest as I stared at the computer screen, the numbers blurring into a mess of red ink and shattered expectations. I asked her where the $300,000 had gone, and she quietly printed out a list of transfers made over the last 6 months to an LLC I had never heard of. Marcus had always handled the big finances, claiming he wanted to protect me from the stress, but now I realized he had been protecting himself from my discovery of his grand theft. I walked out of that bank feeling like the ground was made of glass, every step I took threatening to shatter the very world I had spent my entire adult life constructing. I didn't call him, and I didn't scream. Instead, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 2 hours, watching the people pass by while I felt my soul harden into a diamond. Husbands often forget that a woman has a great power. She can be as sincere and loving as they can imagine, but she can also become their greatest nightmare when her trust is violated. I drove home and greeted him with a kiss, my mind already spinning a web of questions that I wasn't quite ready to ask him to his face because I needed to ensure my revenge was as total as his betrayal. For the next week, I became a ghost in my own home, moving through the rooms with a silent intensity that Marcus was too distracted to notice as he preened in front of the mirror. I started checking the pockets of his dry cleaning, finding receipts for jewelry stores and high-end lingerie boutiques where the sizes were extra small, a far cry from the curves I had carried since our second child was born. I found a burner phone tucked inside the lining of his golf bag, vibrating with messages from a woman named Sienna, who spoke to him in a language of lust and disrespect for the wife he left behind. She called me the old lady, and at the anchor, laughing in text after text about how Marcus was finally going to be free once the final transfer was cleared and the house was sold. My blood turned to ice when I realized he wasn't just cheating and stealing, he was planning to sell our family home out from under me, leaving me with nothing but memories and debt. I stood in our kitchen, the heart of our home, and realized that every meal I had cooked and every celebration we had hosted was being weighed against the thrill of a younger woman's touch. We give our hearts and can do absolutely anything for a loyal husband, but we simply cannot and will not bear their deceit once the veil has been lifted from our eyes. I felt a scream building in my throat, a primal roar of a woman scorned, but I forced it down into the pit of my stomach where it could ferment into a lethal plan. I began to realize that if I confronted him now, he would simply lie, manipulate the legal system, and disappear with what was left of our lives before I could stop him. I sat in my old, reliable sedan across from a trendy downtown bistro, watching Marcus lead a woman who looked like a digital filter come to life into the restaurant with his hand on her lower back. She was young enough to be our daughter, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, laughing at his jokes with a forced brightness that made my skin crawl. I watched him pull out her chair, a gesture of gallantry he hadn't shown me in 15 years, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about a different woman's life. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital camera, clicking photos of them through the rain-streaked windshield, evidence of a betrayal that went far beyond a simple lapse in judgment. I saw him hand her a small, velvet box, and when she opened it, the diamond inside caught the streetlights, mocking me with its brilliance and the fact that it was bought with my sweat. I realized then that Marcus didn't just want a new life, he wanted to erase the old one entirely, and he viewed me as the only obstacle standing in the way of his delusional fountain of youth. He looked happy, a hollow, terrifying kind of happy that relied on the destruction of a woman who had saved his life when his first business failed 20 years ago. I felt the last lingering threads of love for him snap, replaced by a cold, clinical resolve to see him suffer the same poverty and loneliness he had planned for me. I drove away before they finished their appetizers, my mind working through the legal loopholes and financial traps I could set if I just had a little more time and a lot more information. I approached the man, my voice steady despite the trembling in my knees, and asked him why he was surveying my property at 7 o'clock in the evening. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and professional detachment, stating that he was there to finalize the appraisal for the upcoming sale requested by the owner, Marcus Sterling. My breath hitched as he handed me a document, and my eyes landed on a signature that wasn't just Marcus's, but a perfect, chilling forgery of my own name on a quitclaim deed. He hadn't just planned to sell the house, he had already legally transferred my half of the ownership to his secret LLC by faking my consent on government documents. I felt the air leave my lungs as I realized that in the eyes of the law, I was already a guest in my own home, a squatter in the place where I had raised my children and buried my parents. The depth of his depravity was staggering. He was willing to risk prison for fraud just to ensure that I was left with absolutely nothing when he made his grand exit. I thanked the man, told him there must be a mistake with the timing, and walked inside the house, my eyes burning with a heat that felt like it could melt the very walls. I went to the basement where Marcus kept his private files, and for the first time in our marriage, I broke the lock on his mahogany desk with a crowbar I found in the garage. Inside, I didn't just find more financial records, I found a life insurance policy taken out on me, recently increased to a staggering $2 million with Marcus as the sole beneficiary. My hands shook as I read the accidental death clause, and I realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't just waiting for me to go away, he was waiting for me to die. The realization that my husband was potentially plotting my death changed the game from financial survival to a desperate fight for my very existence. I sat on the cold basement floor, surrounded by the evidence of his greed, and felt a calm wash over me that was more frightening than the anger had ever been. I realized that if I went to the police now, he would know I was onto him, and he might accelerate whatever accident he had planned before the slow wheels of justice could turn. I needed to be smarter than him, faster than him, and more ruthless than he ever thought a simple nurse could be in her golden years. I spent the rest of the night scanning every document, every bank statement, and every forged signature, uploading them to a secure cloud drive that he could never access. I discovered that his mistress, Sienna, wasn't just a lover, she was an accomplice who worked at a shady title company, the very one that had processed the fraudulent deed. They were a team of vultures, picking at the bones of my life while I was still very much alive, and they were laughing at my expense every single day. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that they had underestimated me so completely that they left a paper trail a mile wide, assuming I was too broken to ever look. I put everything back exactly as I found it, wiped down the desk, and replaced the lock with a matching one I bought at a 24-hour hardware store before dawn. When Marcus came home that morning, smelling of cheap gin and expensive sin, I had a fresh pot of coffee waiting and a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I watched him drink from the world's best husband mug I'd bought him for his 50th birthday, and I wondered which of us would be the first to draw blood in this silent war. I began my counterattack by visiting an old friend from my nursing school days whose husband was a retired high-stakes private investigator with a grudge against men like Marcus. He took one look at the files I had gathered and told me that Marcus was sloppy, blinded by his own ego and the belief that I was a powerless victim. He helped me set up hidden cameras throughout the house, tiny lenses disguised as smoke detectors and outlet covers that would record every conversation Marcus had in his private moments. Within 48 hours, I had high-definition footage of Marcus and Sienna sitting in my living room, drinking my vintage wine and discussing how they would renovate the house once I was out of the picture. I listened to them joke about my heart condition, laughing about how easy it would be to swap my daily medication with something that would induce a fatal arrhythmia. My blood ran cold as I watched Marcus mimic my voice, mocking the way I thanked him for taking care of me, while Sienna leaned over and kissed him, praising his brilliance. They weren't just criminals, they were sociopaths who viewed my life as a mere line item in their budget for a new life in the Caribbean. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced myself to watch every second, recording their confession of intent to commit murder as if it were a holy relic. I knew now that I couldn't just take his money or his freedom, I had to take everything he valued, including his dignity and his future, before he could take my life. I began to slowly move my own secret assets, the small inheritance from my mother that he didn't know about, into accounts he couldn't touch, preparing for the day I would vanish. To the world, I remained the devoted wife, even going so far as to plan a surprise 65th birthday party for Marcus that would serve as the ultimate stage for his downfall. I invited all of our friends, his business associates, and even his judgmental sister, making sure that everyone who mattered to him would be in the room when the mask finally slipped. I spent weeks acting the part of the doting spouse, asking him for advice on my health and pretending to be more frail than I actually was to lull him into a false sense of security. I watched him look at me with a predatory gleam in his eyes, likely thinking about how much closer he was to that $2 million payout with every dizzy spell I faked. He even had the audacity to suggest we take a romantic weekend to a remote cabin in the mountains, a trip I knew was intended to be my final journey. I agreed with a shy smile, telling him I couldn't wait to be alone with him, while secretly coordinating with my investigator to have the cabin wired for sound and video. The level of my own deception was beginning to scare me, but then I would remember the footage of him laughing about my death, and my heart would turn back to stone. I was no longer a wife or a nurse, I was a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to spring a trap that would ensure he never saw the sun rise as a free man again. I made sure to document every pill he tried to give me, keeping a secret stash of the medication he was tampering with as physical evidence for the forensic labs. The party was only 3 days away, and the tension in the house was so thick I could taste it in the air, a metallic tang of impending doom that only I could recognize. The night before the party, I accidentally left a folder on the kitchen table containing what looked like a new will, one that left everything I owned to a charity Marcus hated. I watched through the hidden camera as he found it, his face turning a shade of purple I had never seen before as he realized I might be trying to redirect the assets he had worked so hard to steal. He didn't know the will was a fake, a decoy designed to make him act impulsively and reveal his hand before the party even began. He spent the next 4 hours on the phone with Sienna, screaming about how the old hag was trying to ruin their plans and that they needed to finish it tonight, instead of waiting for the mountain trip. I sat in the dark of the guest room, listening to my husband plot my murder in real time, feeling a strange sense of peace now that the final cards were on the table. He thought he was the predator, but he was walking straight into a cage I had spent months reinforcing with the steel of his own betrayals. He eventually came into the room with a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly as he offered it to me, claiming it would help me sleep better before the big party. I looked him dead in the eye, seeing the cowardice hidden behind his bravado, and I took the glass from his hand, thanking him for being such a caring husband. I waited until he left the room before pouring the water into a specimen jar I had hidden under the bed, replacing it with plain tap water from a bottle I had stashed. I lay awake all night, listening to him pace the hallway, waiting for the sound of my heart stopping, a sound that was never going to come. The morning of the party arrived, and Marcus looked like a man who had seen a ghost when he found me in the kitchen, vibrant and very much alive, cooking a large breakfast as if nothing had happened. He couldn't understand how I had survived the night, and I watched him struggle to maintain his composure while his entire plan began to crumble around his feet. But the real blow came when my daughter, Maya, called me in tears, telling me that she had found a set of documents in her own mailbox that morning, documents sent anonymously by Sienna. It turned out that Sienna had been playing Marcus just as much as he had been playing me. She had sent my daughter evidence that Marcus had been draining their college funds too. My husband hadn't just betrayed me, he had robbed his own children of their futures, using their inheritance to buy jewelry for a woman who was now selling him out to his own family. I looked at Marcus across the breakfast nook and saw not a man, but a parasite that had fed on the love and labor of an entire family until there was nothing left but husks. He had told Sienna he didn't care about the kids, that they were boring and entitled, and she had recorded it all, using it as leverage to ensure she got a bigger cut of the house sale. The betrayal was a circle, a snake eating its own tail, and Marcus was too arrogant to realize that the woman he was leaving me for was even more ruthless than he was. I felt a surge of cold fury that eclipsed everything else, realizing that my children were now victims in this war he had started for the sake of a midlife crisis and a younger ego. I told Maya to stay calm and get to the party early, because the entertainment I had planned was going to be something the family would never forget. The party began at 7, and our home was filled with the elite of our community, all of them raising glasses to Marcus's incredible career and our inspirational marriage. I wore a dress of deep, blood-red silk, moving through the crowd with a grace that felt like a sharp blade, accepting compliments while I waited for the clock to strike 9. Marcus was playing the part of the successful patriarch, but I could see the sweat on his brow and the way his eyes darted to the door, expecting the police or perhaps Sienna to arrive. He didn't know that I had invited Sienna myself, telling her that Marcus wanted her there to celebrate their imminent victory in front of everyone he knew. When she walked through the door, dressed in a white dress that looked like a mockery of a wedding gown, the room went silent as the guests sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Marcus turned pale, his drink shaking in his hand as he realized his secret world and his public world were finally colliding in a way he couldn't control. I stepped onto the small podium we had set up for speeches, clinking my glass to get everyone's attention. My smile wider than it had been in years. I saw the fear in Marcus's eyes, a beautiful, flickering flame of terror that told me he finally knew he had underestimated the woman he had slept beside for 3 decades. I began my speech by thanking everyone for coming to witness the end of an era, and the beginning of a truth that would set us all free. The guests looked confused, but I didn't give them time to think before I signaled my investigator to start the video presentation I had prepared on the 60-inch screen behind me. The screen flickered to life, not with a montage of our marriage, but with the high-definition footage of Marcus and Sienna in our living room, discussing how they would get rid of the old lady. The gasps from the audience were like a physical wave, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room as my husband's voice boomed through the speakers, mocking his guests and his family. I watched Marcus's sister drop her glass, the red wine splashing against her legs like blood, while Marcus himself seemed to shrink, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his crumbling frame. The video cut to the bank statements, the forged quitclaim deed, and finally, the life insurance policy with the accidental death clause highlighted in bright, glowing yellow. I stood there, a silent sentinel of justice, as the man who thought he could kill me for a paycheck was exposed as a fraud, a thief, and a monster in front of every person he respected. Sienna tried to run for the door, but my daughter and son were already there, blocking her path with a look of such pure hatred that she retreated back into the corner like a trapped rat. The room was no longer a party, it was a courtroom, and I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, all wrapped in red silk and 60 years of resilience. Marcus tried to speak, his voice a pathetic croak, but no one was listening anymore. They were too busy watching the screen as it showed him tampering with my medication in the kitchen. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a lightness I hadn't felt since I was a young girl, knowing that the world finally saw him for exactly what he was. The police arrived just as the video ended, led in by my investigator who had already provided them with the specimen jar of poisoned water and the original forged documents I had recovered. I watched them cuff Marcus in the center of the room he had stolen from me, his face pressed against the very walls he had tried to sell behind my back. He screamed at me, calling me a bitter old bitch and a snake, his mask finally falling away to reveal the ugly, hollow core that had been there all along. Sienna was taken away too, sobbing and screaming that she was a victim, but the evidence of her complicity in the deed, fraud and the murder plot was too overwhelming for any plea for mercy. Our friends and family stood in a circle of silence, watching as the golden couple was dismantled in a matter of minutes, the glitter of our lives revealed to be nothing but cheap tinsel. I walked up to Marcus as they were leading him out, leaning in close so only he could hear my voice, which was as cold as a winter grave. I told him that I had known about the money for months, and that I had already used his own secret LLC to pay off the mortgage and transfer the remaining funds into a trust for our grandchildren. He had worked so hard to steal my life, only to find that he had accidentally funded the very future he wanted to destroy, leaving him with nothing but a prison cell and a public legacy of shame. He lunged at me, his eyes wild with a manic desperation, but the officers held him back, dragging him out of the home he would never step foot in again. In the weeks that followed, the house felt quiet, but it was a clean kind of quiet, like the air after a heavy thunderstorm has washed away the grime of the city. My children stayed with me, helping me navigate the legal fallout and the process of reclaiming my identity from the wreckage Marcus had left behind. I found out that Marcus had tried to blame everything on Sienna, and she had returned the favor, providing even more evidence of his past crimes, including a series of embezzlements from his firm that went back a decade. He was facing 30 years to life, a sentence that meant he would likely die behind bars, a fitting end for a man who had tried to cut my life short for a few pieces of silver. I sat on my porch, watching the sunset, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living for a man, a career, or a set of expectations. I was just living for me, a 60-year-old woman who had survived the unthinkable and come out on the other side with her soul intact and her bank account replenished. But as I was cleaning out the last of Marcus's things from the attic, I found an old, locked trunk that wasn't listed in any of his files, tucked away behind a false wall in the crawlspace. My heart began to race as I forced it open, wondering what other secrets a man like that could have kept hidden for 30 years of marriage. Inside, I didn't find money or more mistress photos. I found a stack of letters and a set of birth certificates that made my world tilt on its axis once again. The birth certificates were for two children, aged 25 and 27, but the mother's name wasn't mine and it wasn't Sienna's. It was my own younger sister's name, the one who had disappeared 28 years ago. I fell to my knees as I realized that the work trips Marcus took during the early years of our marriage were spent with my sister, and that his disappearance, our family had grieved, was a lie he had orchestrated to keep his second family a secret. The letters detailed a life of double betrayal so deep it made the financial theft look like a schoolyard prank. He had been supporting them with our money since the day they were born. But the most terrifying part was the final letter, dated only a week ago, written by my sister, stating that she was tired of hiding and was coming to claim her rightful place in the house now that I was supposed to be dead. I heard a floorboard creak downstairs, a sound that didn't belong to my children or the wind, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that someone had entered the house using a key I didn't know existed. I stood up, clutching the letters to my chest, my mind reeling from the fact that the war wasn't over. It had simply changed fronts, and the enemy was now my own blood. I looked at the security monitor I had kept active, and my heart stopped when I saw a woman who looked exactly like a younger version of me standing in my kitchen, holding a suitcase and a set of house keys. She looked up at the camera and smiled, a cold, familiar expression that told me Marcus hadn't been the only one planning my demise for the last 30 years. I realized then that the accident Marcus had planned was just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved a sister I thought was dead and a secret that was still breathing in my hallway.